Thank you. So I'm going to share a story of 18 years of work with journalists. And it's going to sound a lot neater and tidier and linear than it's actually been. And I'm going to attempt to do it in about 10 minutes so that we've got a few minutes to go into the details. And it is in the spirit of what do you do when you don't know what to do. And the story for me began in 1999 when there was a racially motivated shooting at a Jewish community center in Los Angeles. And at the time, such an event was shocking and rare. And I thought to myself, because in my work with groups, I did a lot of work with storytelling, that the role of story in shaping beliefs and behavior is very powerful, and journalists are cultural storytellers. And I wondered if journalists were telling stories that supported communities to thrive, what would the journalism look like? And what could I do to bring what I knew about storytelling to journalists? So that's where it began for me. And you can't see any of the words on these. It says find allies. So I reached out to a friend of mine who was a former journalist, and she put me in touch with a man who is still a practicing journalist. He connected us with a friend who connected us with what turned out to be the president of a national media organization. And that man asked us a very powerful question, which is, what would it take to have a national conversation about the future of journalism? And that's where it began for us. Now, to fast forward, in 2017, we went from a group of 4 white people of the same generation and socioeconomic background to about 2,000 who have been touched in some way by our work and that are far more diverse in every way that you can imagine. So, what did we do? Well, this looks a bit busy, but the words on the top say listen and experiment. And the question I was asking was, how do we change the social system? And we did it through conversation. Over the past 18 years, we've hosted 20 conversations, and these are the banners from a number of those conversations. And we did it by listening to what is up for the journalists. And by the way, when I say journalists, I'm using the term in a very broad way because we always, as a base practice of what we did, invite the diversity of the system. So it was not just print, broadcast, and new media journalists, but media reformers and media educators. And with time, we began to add audience and other forms of community connectors. And periodically, we would connect journalists and technologists and journalists and librarians. And when we were told by some of our participants that we were too white, we made an explicit effort and reached out to journalists of color through a pair of conferences called Create or Die, a name chosen by the group themselves to describe the way they were feeling. I think a turning point came for us about 2 years ago in 2015, when the notion of engagement has entered into the language of journalists, and it was an opportunity to take what we were actually doing, which was engaging people in conversation, and invite the journalists to experience engagement. And many of the journalists in the room were seeking ways to connect more closely with their community. And so not only did they run with the experience for themselves, but they took it back with them and started practicing conversation within their own communities. So what have we been learning? Periodically, of course, through these last 18 years, we've stepped back and reflected and learned from that experience. And in 2008, when we were meeting with technologists, we thought it would be useful to map the territory. And so we drew a map of journalists as it had been, which is very manufacturing-oriented and very linear. And we drew a map of what we saw emerging at that time, which was much more a circle of connection that actually mentioned community. And in 2015, again, part of a turning point, we started using a practice called developmental evaluation, which is an assessment process that's designed to make visible what is emerging in a complex situation, like a social system. And I think the breakthrough discovery for us in doing that work was that the reinvention of any industry rarely happens from inside it. And so the thing that we found was if we were working at the intersection of journalism and community through this thing called engagement, that we were actually pointing the way towards a different space that transcended and included journalism. And we landed on the term civic communications to describe it. And that would be the space through which journalism could and would reimagine itself. So when I was preparing this, I thought, what is the lesson I most want to share? And I have to tell you, through many of these years, you have the expression spitting in the wind. I mean, it's a very visceral image, and many, many times through these 17 years, I have felt like I was spitting in the wind and asked, is it over? Have we done what we can? Is it time to stop? And people who had participated with us, what many would tell us is they were stretched and refreshed, going back more deeply committed than ever to doing journalism that matters. And they told us that they found partners and that they took on much more ambitious projects than they had been doing before they had the opportunity to talk with people that they never got to talk to. And in this most recent years, we have begun to see this formation of a community of practice of people doing what is coming to be called engaged journalism, journalism that puts community at the center and listens. And that community is beginning to teach itself. It's a community of peers. And just 2 weeks ago, Michelle Holmes, who is here, and I were both at a conference called the Online News Association, 3,000 journalists from all across the system. And one of the things that thrilled me more than I can say is that Michelle and others who are of this community were bringing these ideas of engagement into the room. And so it's small, it's slow, it hasn't touched the national media as yet, but the notion of inclusion and engagement is making its way into the larger system. So I want to say one other thing, because after 18 years, I have been asking myself, what is next for me? And I see it as time of passing the torch, and have been thrilled that younger journalists have come forward who have the bug to do the kind of engaged journalism that is emerging. And in this time of increasing polarization, there is now a readiness and an asking amongst journalists of the question that started with me 18 years ago, of what is the role of journalism in civil discourse, in connecting across divides. And the experiments to do that are beginning to form. And what I've come away with, and you can't even see this on here, but that the roots of creating the kind of journalism that supports communities and democracy to thrive is inclusive, is engaged. And the other element, which isn't yet in the consciousness of journalism, but I hope that we are beginning to seed, is what I would call being generative. making connections, finding the possibilities. So going into the most difficult stories, the most difficult places, and telling stories in a way that people are moved and inspired to discover the possibilities and act upon them. So that is both where we've been and where I hope we're going. And I want to say one other piece that comes out of my own background, which has been to be a student of system change and using the lens of complexity for much of my work through the years to do that, by pairing the lived experience of working with emergent kinds of practices and what the science is teaching us about complexity. This is a pattern that I've observed that informs everything that I do about the way I design, which is from a stable, coherent system. All change begins with disruption, which makes sense if you think about it, because if there were no disruption, there would be no change. But the truth is, disruption is, for most of us, very uncomfortable. It creates fear, it creates anger. It also creates the opening for excitement and possibility. And stepping through that doorway to experiment and to learn, we start discovering the differences that make a difference, which is the heart of learning. And through that, a new kind of coherence that tends to transcend and include more complexity in it can emerge. And so with that, the way I think about the design is create a container in which we're willing to step in to deal with the complexity, to deal with the fear, the anger, to make space for the opportunities to surface through inviting the diversity of the system, through welcoming what shows up, and through asking generative questions, which create the space for people to engage with each other, to bring their authentic selves and to connect, and through that to seek meaning together.